On August 2nd, 1964, the American destroyer USS Maddox, operating off the coast of North Vietnam in a body of water called the Gulf of Tonkin, was attacked by 3 torpedo boats of the North Vietnamese Navy. There was a brief military engagement, during which a number of shots were fired. The American ship carried on without serious damage. 2 nights later, on August 4th, 1964, the Maddox was out there again, this time accompanied by another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, when both ships reported they fell under attack by North Vietnamese craft a second time. This second attack did not occur. There are a host of complex reasons why Navy personnel aboard the ships gave reports that it did, which we'll get into. But the 2 incidents together, particularly the second one, were misrepresented by the administration of President Lyndon B. Johnson as an aggressive attack by North Vietnam against forces of the United States. In reality, the one attack by North Vietnam that did occur was largely in response to American provocation. Johnson, of course, didn't allow that to become public knowledge, thus increasing the reality distortion field around these events. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, as both attacks were generally called, was the impetus for the Johnson White House to ask the U.S. Congress for a resolution authorizing Johnson, as Commander-in-Chief of the American Armed Forces, to, quote, take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. This was the congressional authorization that Johnson used to greatly escalate American involvement in the Vietnam War, particularly during the following year, 1965. As an event in American history, the Gulf of Tonkin incident is extremely problematic and also easily misunderstood. A popular narrative has crystallized around it to the effect that the Johnson administration entirely fabricated the attacks by North Vietnamese torpedo boats as a means to bamboozle the Congress and the American people into authorizing the Vietnam War without proper exploration and popular debate about what exactly was being authorized and what it meant. As with many popular narratives about complex historical events, that narrative is false, or at least highly misleading. The Gulf of Tonkin incident consisted of 2 separate alleged attacks against U.S. Navy ships. One on August 2nd, 1964, the other on August 4th. The first incident on August 2nd undoubtedly did happen. The historical proof that it happened, including corroboration from the Vietnamese themselves, is unmistakable. The second incident on August 4th did not happen, but it was not fabricated out of whole cloth with malice aforethought. It was clearly misused politically in very cynical ways by the Johnson administration, and the reasons why the false reports of the August 4th alleged attack were given such credit at the time are complex. The political implications of the Gulf of Tonkin incident were also extremely complicated. They had more to do with domestic politics and Lyndon Johnson's then ongoing campaign for the presidency of the United States in 1964 against his Republican opponent Barry Goldwater than they did international concerns, much less a prearranged plan for fighting the Vietnam War. But again, the whole story is pretty convoluted and takes a lot of context, analysis, and careful reading of the facts and sources to be able to make an informed judgment about it. But that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. I'm going to give you the background, the context, the facts, and the analysis of the Gulf of Tonkin incidents. Too often, this critical event in recent American history is oversimplified or distorted, particularly by conspiracy theory narratives, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms. This is the Gulf of Tonkin incident, explained and deconstructed. Hi, I'm Sean Munger. I have a PhD in history, and my niche here on YouTube is doing long, context-heavy, deep dive analyses of historical events. It's been a while since I've done one here, and I'm back to continue the tradition. Yes, the physical surroundings have changed, but the game is the same, and the name of the game is Let's Understand Some History. Before we get into the substance of this video, I want to mention 2 brief things. The first is that here on my YouTube channel, I now have a members-only section. If you're interested in my videos and want more, think about becoming a member. There's one tier so far, $5 a month, and at that tier, you'll get some extra material. For example, if you become a member, you can watch an extended version of this video without ads and with some expanded content. There's an extra chapter, for example, in the members-only version, and I cover some subjects in more depth. So think of it as sort of the director's cut, so to speak. There will also be some other members-only content, such as unredacted versions of some videos. Remember, for example, there were certain images I couldn't show in the August 1939 video because of YouTube's monetization guidelines. Well, they're restored in the members tier version. Anyway, there is now a membership section, which only just started. So if you want to join, YouTube makes it pretty easy to do. The second thing, I've got a new book out on December 17th, 2024 on Amazon. It's called The Gangster Crown, and it's a crime story taking place mostly in the 1990s, profiling the rise and fall of a notorious organized crime kingpin. It's brand new and available on Kindle. Link to it is here in this video and in the description. And there will also be a paperback version available shortly, if there isn't already. So check it out. It's a fun book. So now, back to the Gulf of Tonkin. I thought this was a perfect subject for my style of deep dive video analysis. The subject has come up twice before in previous videos I've done in the past. It came up in the two-part series of deep dive videos I did in 2022 on the JFK assassination. Oswald acted alone, which I'll say more about in a moment. It also came up in my video made about a year ago about the Watergate affair. Watergate and its history are deeply connected to the war in Vietnam, so that's how we got there. So yes, I did make a series of videos delving deeply into the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and in those videos I presented the facts and the logical analysis that prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that there was not a conspiracy to assassinate Kennedy in November 1963. There was one assassin, that being Lee Harvey Oswald, and he very clearly acted alone, without help from others, or on the orders of anyone else. Not the CIA, not the FBI, not the Mafia, not the Cubans, not the Beatles. Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated Kennedy alone. Now, as soon as I say that, I realize certain members of the audience are going to shut off this video in disgust and declare that I am insane, delusional, stupid, a bad historian, or being paid by the CIA. As if one of the main functions of the CIA is to pay people to make videos on YouTube. There's not much I can do about those people except to say, don't let the door hit you on the way out, and enjoy your cat videos. But for those of you who are actually interested in the facts, in the historical context and analysis of what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin in August 1964 and what did not happen, you may be surprised by certain things you learn here. The conspiracy narrative of this event, which I'll deconstruct at length toward the end of the video, is heavily intertwined with JFK conspiracy fantasies, which is why I'm mentioning it up front. In fact, the Gulf of Tonkin is mentioned prominently in one of the most recognizable and widely known fantasies about Kennedy's assassination, that being Oliver Stone's criminally inaccurate film JFK from 1991. That film is at least partially responsible for crystallizing that false popular narrative of the Gulf of Tonkin affair. Again, we'll get there eventually, just bear with me. I want to mention another movie in connection with this topic. It's a documentary made in 2003, Fog of War, in which documentarian Errol Morris conducted a lengthy interview with Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense during 1964, when the Gulf of Tonkin incident happened. In that documentary, often quoted in support of the conspiracy narrative, McNamara clearly stated that the August 4th attack on the USS Turner Joy did not happen. But he also clearly states, conspiracy theorists don't tell you this, that the August 2nd attack undoubtedly did happen. In fact, many years after the Vietnam War was over, McNamara interviewed the former North Vietnamese defense minister, and they discussed the two purported Gulf of Tonkin attacks, one which did happen and one which did not. McNamara is a convenient focus for a critical analysis of how the United States got so deeply into the Vietnam War. That's largely because McNamara was uniquely aggressive among Johnson's advisors in arguing for escalating the war in 1964 and 65, and also because, even by the time he left office as Secretary of Defense in early 1968, he was beginning to have deep regrets about having taken that course. But important as he is, McNamara was not the most important historical personality connected with the Gulf of Tonkin affair or the Vietnam War as a whole. Far from it. We'll talk about him, but you should know that this is not predominantly Robert McNamara's story. One further housekeeping matter. There are a lot of Vietnamese names in this story. I do not speak Vietnamese. I'm doing the best I can with pronunciations. It may not be very good, but I'm trying. If you do speak Vietnamese, I ask your forgiveness for my shortcomings in that regard. Finally, I say it at the end of every video, but I've decided to say it at the beginnings too. The sources I used to research this topic and to make this video are listed in credits at the end, and also in the description. In this case, I highly recommend Edwin Moise's very in-depth study on the Gulf of Tonkin affair. There are two editions, one from 1996, the other revised in 2019. It's probably the best single historical treatment of this complicated issue, drawing upon a wealth of primary source documents. If you want to know more, that's where to go. Now, before we get into what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, we have to go through a lot of context. What was the United States doing in Vietnam in 1964 in the first place? What were the Vietnamese trying to accomplish? How did these two countries find themselves on a collision course? That's all in the next chapter. Vietnam is a country that for virtually its entire existence has been uniquely allergic to domination by any foreign powers. Not that there are a lot of nations out there that would willingly accept being colonized by other countries, but resistance and self-determination are uniquely baked into the Vietnamese national character. The Chinese found this out. They dominated Vietnam for over 1,000 years, throughout most of the Middle Ages, and the Vietnamese never stopped resisting. France began colonizing Southeast Asia in the 1860s, eventually turning it into a colony called Indochina, from which the modern countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were eventually carved. The period of modern Vietnamese nationalist resistance to colonialism got rolling in earnest after World War I. During the war, the French conscripted nearly 100,000 Vietnamese and sent them overseas to fight or to work as laborers. One of the Vietnamese nationalist movement's main figures was Ho Chi Minh, who was in Paris in 1919 and tried unsuccessfully to represent the Vietnamese people at the Versailles peace talks. World War II brought another would-be colonizer, the Japanese, who invaded Southeast Asia in 1940 after France was defeated by Nazi Germany, leaving its various colonies around the world essentially orphaned. After the Japanese were defeated in the Pacific War in 1945, Vietnamese nationalists under Ho Chi Minh seized the moment to declare independence. It didn't stick. France, liberated by the Allies, wanted to keep her Southeast Asian colonies, bucking the trend of other Allied powers to give up their colonial possessions, with varying degrees of reluctance, including the United States, which granted independence to the Philippines in 1946, and Britain, which gave up India the following year. I mention these because you have to see the post-World War II history of Vietnam in the context of a broader trend toward decolonialization. The Vietnam War was about decolonialization. The French fought a brutally destructive war to try to hang on to Vietnam. It lasted from 1946 to 1954, with the French on one side and a guerrilla army called the Viet Minh fighting for Vietnamese independence on the other. The problem for Western powers, particularly the United States, was that the Vietnamese nationalist movement was communist in orientation. Ho Chi Minh was a communist. What Americans didn't tend to understand, though, was that Ho was a nationalist first and a communist second. His main goal was an independent and united Vietnam. He wanted that independent Vietnam to be a communist country, but the nationalist independence goal, not the spread of worldwide revolution, was his primary objective. This is what Americans, from Harry Truman down to Lyndon Johnson, could never quite grasp. In May 1954, the Viet Minh handed the French a military defeat that they never recovered from. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu is one of the most pivotal battles of the entire 20th century. What you're looking at is a system of tunnels that were used by the Viet Minh during this battle, and which have been turned into a national monument. Dien Bien Phu is in the Vietnamese national character what the Battle of Yorktown is to Americans, the decisive battle that overthrew the colonizers and cemented national independence. Dien Bien Phu occurred literally one day before an international conference in Geneva got underway to discuss a political settlement in Southeast Asia, and also Korea. The Korean War had just reached a ceasefire the year before. The story of this conference is horrendously complicated and extremely depressing, but fortunately, I don't need to go into it in great detail. Suffice it to say, the Geneva Conference split Vietnam into two countries, one in the north, which was effectively controlled by Ho Chi Minh and his communist regime, and one in the south, which would in short order be led by a man called Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic and staunch anti-communist. The split was supposed to be temporary. New elections were supposed to happen the next year, 1955, to choose a national unity government. But Diem and South Vietnam and the United States refused to be bound by the Geneva Accords, and the national unity elections never happened. Diem, who became president of South Vietnam, eventually became a dictator. Now there were two Vietnams, a communist North Vietnam, whose capital was Hanoi, and a pro-Western South Vietnam, with its capital in Saigon. For their part, the North Vietnamese, the communists, never gave up the goal of a united Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, and particularly his second-in-command, Le Duan, always intended to reunify the country by force if necessary, but they realized they were pretty weak after that war with the French. In 1959, however, reunification by force became the official North Vietnamese policy. They formed an irregular army, which came to be known as the Viet Cong, to operate in South Vietnam to destabilize the regime. This was in addition to North Vietnam's regular national army. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese armed forces are separate, remember that, but they were working toward the same overarching goal. This was not happening in a vacuum. Reunification of Vietnam was the major goal, but the North Vietnamese communists were also focused on helping install governments friendly to them in other parts of former Indochina, Laos, which is here, and Cambodia down here. This whole area was a focus of a lot of revolutionary armed struggle. But in the 1950s and 1960s, the communist world was fractured. The Soviet Union under Khrushchev and the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong had fallen out with each other, certainly by 1959. The North Vietnamese wanted and received help in their struggle from both communist giants, but the split between them continually complicated politics in this period. As for the United States, they really didn't care about South Vietnam or Laos for their own sake. Just after World War II, President Harry Truman had developed the American foreign policy of containment, which meant preventing the expansion of communist influence anywhere it didn't already exist. Anti-communism became sort of a political religion in America, particularly after the government of China, an American ally in World War II, flipped to communism when Mao finally won the 20-year Chinese Civil War in 1949. Truman got blamed for quote-unquote losing China to the communists, as if it was ever his to lose. The Korean War, which involved an attempt by communist North Korea to take over the non-communist pro-American South Korea by force of arms, entrenched reflexive anti-communism in U.S. foreign policy. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, won the election to become U.S. president. It was during Eisenhower's two terms in the 1950s that the concept of the domino theory gained currency in policy circles. This was the idea that if one country in a region of the world flipped to communism, others would quickly fall one by one like dominoes. Eisenhower and his people, like John Foster Dulles, strongly believed in this idea, and it was thought to particularly apply in Southeast Asia. Eisenhower, more than any president who had come before him, developed the technique of using covert operations, often directed by the CIA and to some degree the military, to shore up pro-US regimes overseas and to interfere with hostile ones, usually meaning communist or left-leaning ones. This appeared terribly sinister, and often genuinely was, but there was something of a desperation strategy about it as well. Eisenhower was reluctant to commit American military forces directly in various places around the world to fight communist or left-leaning regimes, especially after the Korean War. He knew Congress and the American public wouldn't get on board for wars of that nature, which would look to the world like colonialist adventures, and rightfully so. With direct commitment of troops off the table, at least on a large scale, what was left but behind-the-scenes covert operations to prop up this regime or that, or destabilize one or another? The bureaucracy of American intelligence and military apparatus, people today call it the deep state, although that term wasn't around then, began to turn the planning of these sorts of operations into one of its central functions. I said a moment ago that Eisenhower was reluctant to commit American forces directly around the world to fight communist expansion. That is true, but it's only barely true. He and his advisors did strongly consider intervening directly in Vietnam in 1954, as soon as the French were defeated, to prevent a communist victory over any part of the country. The use of nuclear weapons was even part of these discussions, though I don't know how serious that part was. The point is, there were theoretical plans, at least on paper, for a major direct escalation of military conflict in Vietnam, nearly 11 years before it actually happened. Now, that does not mean that an escalation was decided upon and then waiting in the wings for 11 years for an excuse to implement it. It's not like that. There are reasons why Eisenhower didn't do it, and why Kennedy didn't either. But what Eisenhower did do, beginning in 1959, was to send American military personnel to support and prop up South Vietnam's rather incompetent and ineffectual army, which was constantly fighting the Viet Cong. These American troops were euphemistically called advisors, and they were not supposed to participate in direct combat against Viet Cong or North Vietnamese military forces. By the time he left office in early 1961, this was as far as Eisenhower was willing to go to thwart Hanoi's plans to reunify Vietnam by force. John F. Kennedy, the new president, Democratic Party, inherited this mess, as well as a diplomatic crisis in Laos, which was linked to the one in Vietnam. By the time Kennedy took over, it was pretty well understood within the U.S. government that, like him or not, and they generally didn't like him, American policy was tied to Ngo Dinh Diem, the president/dictator of South Vietnam. Diem was vain and incompetent, generally more interested in keeping himself and his family in power and enriching themselves than in governing South Vietnam, much less doing Kennedy's bidding. Most of the time, Diem seemed less interested in sticking his neck out to prevent a victory by North Vietnam than the American administration did. Successive U.S. ambassadors to South Vietnam spent much of their time telling Diem that he'd better shape up and pull his country together to resist the North more effectively. For his part, Diem understood that the U.S., particularly Kennedy, would never desert him, no matter what. So why should he stick his neck out when he could continually call upon the United States for more money, more military aid, more advisors, and they would always agree in the end. The Viet Cong often used terrorist tactics. Bombing here, an assassination there. A classic tactic of theirs was to have one of their people sneak up on a base where American quote-unquote advisors were staying and chuck a bomb into it, or poke a machine gun through the windows and spray the place with bullets. Of course, they targeted South Vietnamese military and officials too, all the time. South Vietnam's government was horribly corrupt and completely infiltrated by North Vietnamese spies and double agents. The whole thing was just a nightmare. In the spring of 1963, Diem's mismanagement created a new crisis for Kennedy and the U.S. Diem, a Catholic, had always favored Catholics in his government and society, but a majority of Vietnam's people were Buddhist. Exactly what percentage is disputed, but it does seem to have been a majority. In May 1963, a street protest by Buddhists against discrimination was put down violently by Diem's police and military, and a number of civilians were killed. Diem acted slowly and dragged his feet on a response. Americans were outraged. Diem's repression against a Buddhist majority in his own country cast very public doubt on whether South Vietnam was as truly aligned with the United States as American officials had been insisting for years that it was. From this point on, Kennedy realized that Diem was a lost cause. The intelligence services had been feeding him information, rumors really, that a coup against Diem was afoot in Saigon. Kennedy approved the coup, or at least did nothing to try to stop it. Though when it actually happened, on November 2nd, 1963, only 20 days before his own death, he was horrified by the result. A group of ambitious generals rose up against Diem and his brother, another high official in South Vietnam's government, and blew them away in the back of an armored car. Now the White House had no choice but to hope that whoever took control in South Vietnam could stabilize the country and stave off what they were constantly warned was an imminent defeat by North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. Kennedy's problem was that he tried to have it both ways. He was unwilling to pull out the advisors. I will address allegations to the contrary in the chapter about the conspiracy narratives. But, on the other hand, he continually rebuffed the military and intelligence planners' suggestions that he escalate the conflict or commit American forces more directly. Kennedy's policy on Vietnam was essentially incoherent. Of course, Kennedy himself was assassinated in Dallas on November 22nd by Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone. You can watch my nearly 4-hour video series from 2022 about how and why we know that to be true. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, inherited the Vietnam mess from Kennedy. Johnson, LBJ, was reluctant to get more deeply involved in Vietnam, and he had two much bigger priorities vying for his attention: civil rights and winning the election in his own right in 1964. Thus, as big a mess as Vietnam was at the end of 1963 and first half of 64, it went on the back burner as much as possible. But of course, throughout that period, the covert and not so covert operations, the stuff involving the advisors, was still going on. One of those operations, it turns out, is crucial to the story of how the Tonkin Gulf affair developed. I will turn to that in the next chapter. In May 1961, President John F. Kennedy approved a plan to increase American covert operations against North Vietnam. The government and military of South Vietnam was supposed to be leading raids and subterfuge against the North, but the United States had basically become a full partner in these kinds of operations. In practice, these were classic action movie shenanigans. Secret commando teams with orders to blow up bridges or infrastructure dropped into the jungle at night from low-flying planes, frogmen swimming ashore along the coast of North Vietnam, that sort of thing. There were also spy missions aimed at listening in on North Vietnamese radio communications. In real life, this action movie stuff didn't usually go as well as it does in Hollywood. Many of the teams were killed or captured by the North Vietnamese. The nationality of the spies and commandos who took part in these attacks is unclear. Officially, this whole thing was supposed to be a South Vietnamese operation, but in reality, the missions were heavily backed up by American military personnel, those quote-unquote advisors that Eisenhower and JFK had been sending into the country. But there were other nationalities too. Some Taiwanese took part in a few raids. There were also reports of West Germans and Norwegians taking part, often among the crews of the Swift boats that carried commando teams to the coast. The whole thing was very murky. The idea was to keep as many American fingerprints off the operations as possible, as if anybody would be fooled that they weren't being directed and supported by the US government and military. At first, these covert operations were directed mostly by the CIA, but by 1963, William Colby, head of the CIA's Far East Division, he later became CIA director, was starting to sour on these shenanigans. The US military, especially the Navy, increasingly took over the guidance of. Colby even warned Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, that this action movie cloak and dagger stuff was dumb and didn't work, but McNamara ignored him. In the summer of 1963, the Navy came up with a new plan for these covert operations. I really dislike all the silly, ominous-sounding military and intelligence agency acronyms that pop up in the Vietnam story, and I try not to use them, but there's no way around this one, which was called Operation Plan 3463, or OP Plan, O-P-L-A-N. The plan was modified over the next few months. Not long after attaining office in the wake of Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon Johnson approved a revised plan, Op Plan 34A, which had several different projected phases. One of the major objectives of Op Plan 34A focused on the coast of Vietnam. A major preoccupation of South Vietnam and the American government was what they call infiltration, meaning North Vietnamese agents and Viet Cong moving into South Vietnam from the north to carry on the civil war there, or supplying the ones who were already there. South Vietnam was horribly corrupt, and it was pretty easy for communist agents to get into the country, whether by boats on the coast or on land, across a route that Americans nicknamed the Ho Chi Minh Trail. A huge amount of military operations in the Vietnam War were aimed at stopping this infiltration, about as effective in the long run as trying to plug leaks in the hull of a boat that's already full of water. Part of the reason why this idea was so useless is that Vietnam, both north and south, has a very long coast. I mean, look at it on the map. There's no way you're going to control this whole coastline and what goes ashore on it, no matter how big a navy you've got. The Vietnamese coast was and is heavily trafficked by small boats, a lot of them fishing sampans. They just sort of drift around out there catching fish. And if you're a North Vietnamese agent wanting to smuggle weapons or explosives to your fellow agents in South Vietnam, what better way to do it than load your stuff aboard a small ordinary sampan and blend in with the fishing vessels? This is why American military planners were interested in trying to patrol the coast. Raids and spy movie stuff was also conducted along the coast. The Navy SEALs had teams trained to infiltrate the coast of North Vietnam, and they did their best to train the South Vietnamese how to do it. Because of all this activity along the coast, the North Vietnamese naturally had a navy. Their mission was to patrol the coasts and facilitate the movement of weapons, supplies, and agents into South Vietnam to carry on the war there. The North Vietnamese didn't have any big ships. The main type of craft in their navy were gunboats called the Shan Tao class, known by Americans as Swatows. They were built in China, about 83 feet long, 25.3 meters, and they were lightly armed with 37mm machine guns. They also had about a dozen Soviet-built torpedo boats called P-4s. About 66 feet long, it's a little over 20 meters. They were smaller and lighter than the Shan Tao class gunboats, but they did carry torpedo tubes, theoretically capable of sinking a large naval vessel. This is an island called Han Me off the coast of northern Vietnam. We're not going to get to see a lot of the terrain of Vietnam in this video, but having taught an online course on the subject that heavily utilizes Google Earth locations, I can tell you that most Americans have a very distorted view of what the physical environment of Vietnam is actually like, and most of it comes from movies. This island base, located in the Gulf of Tonkin, is where the North Vietnamese Navy sometimes based its gunboats and torpedo boats, such as on the night of the first Gulf of Tonkin attack. In addition to the action movie shenanigans provided by Op Plan 34A, the U.S. Navy also conducted something called DeSoto patrols. DeSoto is another acronym, standing for De Haven Special Operations off Tsingtao. Basically a mobile module full of electronic surveillance equipment and sweaty guys wearing headphones would be loaded on board a Navy ship, which would tool around hostile coasts trying to listen in on radio signals. The DeSoto program was originally developed in 1962 to spy on the Red Chinese. It was inevitable that the Navy would start using them against the North Vietnamese, and indeed, DeSoto patrols were authorized in the Gulf of Tonkin in December 1962, April 1963, and February 1964. These patrols dovetailed with the Op Plan 34A stuff. In that part of their mission was to scope out North Vietnamese coastal defenses so the spy movie commando missions would theoretically know what they were going up against. The North Vietnamese and the Chinese knew that all this stuff was going on. The commando raids, the electronic surveillance, everything. It's not like it was a secret. In fact, American military planners wanted them to know this was all happening, as part of sending some kind of political message to them about American resolve to not let South Vietnam go communist. I hope you see where all this is going. The take-home point is that there was a great deal of mishigas going on around the coast of the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964 on all sides: American, North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, and Chinese. With all this happening, a confrontation between American naval forces and North Vietnamese naval forces at some point was inevitable. In addition to it being militarily inevitable, something like the Gulf of Tonkin incident was also politically inevitable. The North Vietnamese had decided as far back as 1959 that they would fight a long and protracted war to unify Vietnam and free it from colonial domination by Western powers. And they definitely saw domination by the United States as a continuation of French colonial rule. For their part, American policymakers were firmly determined not to let South Vietnam flip to the communist side. Though in 1964, at least at the top, Lyndon Johnson was generally reluctant to think about how big of a military and political commitment it would take to accomplish that, if it could be accomplished at all. This chapter has been about the operational detail in the background of the Gulf of Tonkin affair, and it's gone into much more fine-grained military type of details than I usually like to do in my videos. But in this case, it was necessary. However, it would be a mistake to go into the Gulf of Tonkin incidents focusing only on what was happening in the waters off Vietnam. The domestic political situation in the U.S. was, I think, an even more critical part of the context. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, and particularly the Gulf of Tonkin congressional resolution, would not have happened without the political circumstances of the 1964 election in the background, or foreground, you could say. That's where we're going in the next chapter. John F. Kennedy had been planning to run for re-election in 1964, and most political observers thought it was pretty likely that he'd win. After his assassination by Lee Harvey Oswald in November 1963, the parameters of the upcoming presidential race obviously shifted dramatically. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who spent most of his career in the U.S. Senate, had come aboard Kennedy's 1960 ticket somewhat reluctantly, and he truly hated, being vice president. But now that he was sitting in the big chair, he wasn't about to let it go. Johnson had slightly less than a year between the assassination in Dallas and the time he would have to stand on his own as a candidate for the presidency. He did not take his election for granted in the slightest. Civil rights was undoubtedly the most important issue on America's plate as the 1964 campaign season got going. The summer and fall of 1963 had been dominated by the political fight to get a major Civil Rights Act through Congress, which would ban segregation and racial discrimination in many walks of American life, from public accommodations to education, and not just for African Americans, but also women and other historically marginalized groups. There were also important labor provisions in the act. After waffling on civil rights for the first part of his term, Kennedy eventually threw his support behind the proposed Civil Rights Act. Drumming up public pressure on Congress to pass the act was the major reason for the August 1963 March on Washington, a massive demonstration principally organized by civil rights leader Bayard Rustin, the mentor of Dr. Martin Luther King, whose unforgettable oratory on this occasion vastly overshadowed Rustin's own arguably more important contributions. The Civil Rights Act was stalled in Congress at the time of Kennedy's assassination. Lyndon Johnson, who strongly believed in it, used his considerable political skill by framing the issue of passage of the act as a tribute to the fallen president. He used his first address to a joint session of Congress on November 27, 1963, to urge passage of the act. Naturally, Southern segregationists, most of them in the Democratic Party, hated the idea of equal rights for African Americans. After an epic filibuster ultimately failed, the U.S. Senate passed its version of the Civil Rights Act on June 19, 1964, only a few weeks before the Gulf of Tonkin incident. There was still some legislative finishing up to do in the House. Civil rights was only part of LBJ's expansive vision for his presidency. He also dreamed of a wide range of domestic programs, a second New Deal that would redefine the role of government in American society for all time. He wanted economic assistance for the poor, money for education and housing, health care for the elderly, and a host of judicial and legislative reforms that would put teeth into the promises of equality contained in the 14th Amendment. Johnson began referring to his vision in May 1964 as the Great Society, though he didn't hit it that hard on the campaign trail at first. His idea was essentially that the United States in the 1960s had now enjoyed a generation of prosperity, and the American people could afford to address many of the social and economic problems it had long neglected. The proof of this seemed to be in the economic numbers. Kennedy had proposed, and Johnson got passed early in his presidency, a major across-the-board tax cut for top earners, which resulted in a sharp rise in the gross national product. Johnson also lowered military spending significantly in 1964, an interesting fact that undercuts the idea that he was just waiting for an opportunity to escalate the conflict in Vietnam. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, a kind of civil war was going on within the party. For a long time, since the 1940s really, the national-level Republican Party had been dominated by what you might call country club Republicans, conservative-leaning moderates who were more pro-business than most Democrats, but who, aside from that, didn't have a lot of significant policy differences with the Democratic Party. The epitome of this tradition was New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who had been a rival for the 1960 nomination that eventually went to Richard Nixon. But a new kind of conservative movement was brewing in the early 60s, centered mostly in the South and West. This wing of the Republican Party was more ideological, leaning toward government non-interference with the economy in the states, and an even more fiercely combative anti-communist foreign policy than that urged by the country club Republicans or the mainstream Democratic Party. In 1964, the champion of those conservatives was Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. We don't need to go into all the twists and turns of the 1964 Republican primary season. Suffice it to say, it was a hard-fought battle between Goldwater and Rockefeller. Many Republicans thought Goldwater's views were too extreme, too far right, and that he'd lose the general election against LBJ. Rockefeller, however, had a personal problem. Previous year, 1963, he married his second wife, Margaretta Fittler, also known as Happy. She had been one of Rockefeller's office staff, and he began an affair with her while he was still married to his first wife, with whom he had a family. Happy was also married and had children. When each of the couple divorced their spouses and then married each other, they alienated a lot of what today we'd call values voters. Republicans weren't ready for a divorcee in the Oval Office. Yeah, that would change. To make matters worse, Happy Rockefeller was pregnant with the couple's first child together during the peak of the primary season. This kept the issue in the headlines. Rockefeller blew a 17-point lead to Goldwater and eventually lost the nomination to him. Goldwater's perceived willingness to resort to military force against communists was alarming to many Republicans and almost all Democrats. He wanted to take the fight to the Reds pretty much everywhere, all the time. LBJ and the Democrats painted him as an extremist who would act irresponsibly on the world stage, possibly even using nuclear weapons against communist countries. Goldwater wasn't exactly the mad bomber that LBJ made him out to be, but he did constantly assail the Johnson administration for being too soft, especially in Vietnam. The fact that LBJ lampooned Goldwater as an extremist and something of a buffoon was cover for their real concerns about him. Above all, Goldwater represented the antidote to what many Americans in the 1960s called the Eastern establishment. Wealthy, white, prep school and Ivy League educated intellectual bureaucrats who believed, somewhat arrogantly, that they knew best how to run the country and that they were, in some sense, entitled to do so. The Johnson White House was filled with these kinds of people, largely because that was the sector from which John F. Kennedy chose most of his advisors, and Johnson kept most of them on after the assassination as a sign of continuity and trust. These were people like McGeorge Bundy. Yes, McGeorge, MC is part of his real first name, LBJ's national security advisor. Bundy was a Republican, educated at the Groton School, Yale, Skull and Bones Society. McGeorge Bundy's older brother Bill, who also had many of these same credentials and had been on staff at the CIA, also worked in the Kennedy and Johnson White Houses. He was an advisor on foreign affairs regarding matters in the Far East. Another example, Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, not born a blue blood, but who went to Oxford University on a Rhodes Scholarship. And perhaps the most prominent in our story, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, who earned an MBA from Harvard Business School, former president of Ford Motor Company, and who had a reputation as an intellectual, one of the smartest and most capable men in America. Johnson felt somewhat insecure among these people. After all, he was from the Texas Hill Country, pretty much the opposite of the Harvard-educated blue bloods who worked with Kennedy. Yet his White House was stuffed to the rafters with these people, and he had chosen them as his chief advisors. It was a very awkward situation, and the psychology of it and the subtle class dynamics help explain why Johnson was a little afraid that Goldwater was more of an electoral threat than he might seem at first glance. Vietnam was not a big issue in the 1964 campaign. However, it wasn't a non-issue either. Going into the summer of 1964, Johnson was afraid Goldwater would attack him from the right on his anti-communist foreign policy. And LBJ was also concerned that his Vietnam policy might become an issue in the congressional races down the ballot. LBJ had come from Congress, and he paid a great deal of attention to them. After all, he needed them to get his Great Society programs passed if and when he won the election. Primarily for these reasons, to neutralize the Vietnam issue from Goldwater and in Congress, Johnson started thinking about asking Congress to pass some sort of resolution backing up his policies. If he got it, he could say that Congress and thus the country was behind him. And such a resolution was essentially a dare to Goldwater, daring him either to support it too, thus eliminating it as a campaign weapon, or denouncing it as not going far enough, which would give the Johnson campaign an opening to paint Goldwater once again as a trigger-happy extremist out of step with public opinion. This was why the Johnson White House began working quietly on a draft congressional resolution to authorize the president to basically do whatever he wanted in Vietnam. This is the resolution that would eventually become the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Bill Bundy John D. McGeorge's brother took the laboring oar in drafting it, beginning in about May of 1964. Note again that it was done primarily for domestic political reasons, the upcoming election, and was not part of a deep-dyed plot to escalate the war, which is the conspiracy theorist narrative. Nevertheless, early summer 1964 was not the time politically to try to get the resolution through Congress. Johnson and his advisors felt it was better to wait for the time being. David Halberstam, who wrote one of the seminal books on how the U.S. got pulled into Vietnam and a major source for this video, put it this way, quote, "In June, Johnson's own intuitive sense of the Congress told him that the time was not right, that he could just not spring the resolution on the Congress, but rather he must mold it to events, and if possible, tie it to an issue of patriotism. Something would have to come along." End quote. On June 21st, 1964, 2 days after the Senate passed the Civil Rights Act, 3 civil rights workers and members of the Congress on Racial Equality, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, disappeared near Philadelphia, Mississippi, while driving to investigate the burning of an African-American church. These 3 were part of a movement called Freedom Summer, which among other things sought to register African Americans to vote in the upcoming elections. 2 days later, on June 23rd, the group's burnt-out station wagon was found abandoned along a nearby highway. Though it was not publicly known at the time, Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner had been lynched by a racist mob, most of whose participants were affiliated with the local Ku Klux Klan. But at the time, their disappearance triggered press attention as well as concern from the White House. Johnson told FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover to investigate personally, which Hoover, who was pretty hostile to the idea of civil rights, was reluctant to do. Let's move on to take a look at what was going on both in the United States and across the world in Vietnam on the eve of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On July 2nd, 1964, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the final version of the Civil Rights Act with a vote of 289 to 126. Later that day, President Lyndon Johnson signed the bill into law. This famous photo was taken on that day at the signing ceremony. This was one of the greatest legislative acts of the 20th century in America. It also began a profound political realignment in American politics, the party shift, especially on issues of race, that would become unmistakable by the elections of the Reagan era 16 years later. A lot was happening during the month of July 1964. Those 3 civil rights workers, Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner, were still missing down there in Mississippi. On his nightly news broadcast on June 25th, CBS anchor Walter Cronkite declared their case, quote, "the focus of the whole country's concern." Republicans were planning to gather at the Cow Palace in San Francisco for the Republican National Convention. Indeed, on July 16th, Barry Goldwater accepted the Republican nomination for president. William Miller, a representative from New York State, was his running mate. The clash between the country club Republicans, the Eastern establishment, and Goldwater's Southern and Western conservatives continued right down to the floor of the convention. When he got up to speak, delegates booed Nelson Rockefeller and heckled him as an Eastern liberal. Reporter John Chancellor was famously arrested on the floor of the convention hall while broadcasting. Goldwater mentioned Vietnam briefly in his acceptance speech. While assailing the Kennedy and Johnson administration's record, he said, quote, "Now failures cement the wall of shame in Berlin. Failures blot the sands of shame at the Bay of Pigs. Failures mark the slow death of freedom in Laos. Failures infest the jungles of Vietnam. And failures haunt the houses of our once great alliances and undermine the greatest bulwark ever erected by free nations, the NATO community." End quote. Throughout the spring and summer of 1964, Op Plan 34A attacks against North Vietnam had been going on the whole time. Various teams of airborne commandos and attacks launched from U.S. Navy patrol boats armed with torpedoes, PT boats, ramped up in July and August. On the night of June 26, 1964, a team of 7 South Vietnamese commandos, supported by 24 U.S. Marines, infiltrated Thanh Hoa Province in North Vietnam along the Gulf of Tonkin, and they blew up a bridge there. Another attack with commandos landed on the beach by rubber boat occurred on the night of June 30th. On July 15th, there was another infiltration penetration by US-backed commandos. Furthermore, US Navy PT boats were firing at various targets on the North Vietnamese coast. Because the rate of Op Plan 34A attacks along the coast was increasing, American forces wanted better intelligence on North Vietnamese coastal defenses. In July, the US Navy decided to run another one of those DeSoto patrols along the coast for this purpose. The ship assigned to conduct the patrol was the destroyer USS Maddox. The destroyer would have one of those mobile communications vans aboard it when it went into the Gulf of Tonkin. This is a view on Google Earth, a drone shot, obviously, of the port of Keelung, Taiwan. This is where the Maddox departed from on her fateful cruise. The final briefings on the mission were conducted aboard the ship here on July 27, 1964, a Monday. The ship left shortly thereafter to conduct the patrol. On the night of July 30th, another Op Plan 34A raid took place. This is critical to the whole story. This is the island of Hon Nu, off the coast of Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. This is one of two islands with North Vietnamese radar and military installations that were attacked that night by 4 PT boats. The raids shelled the targets with 57mm rifles, a form of light infantry cannon. That kind of weapon had not been used in these raids before and represented an escalation. The boats that did this attack passed the USS Maddox as she entered the Gulf of Tonkin the following morning. The next day, August 1st, 2 American-made aircraft bombed some villages across the border of North Vietnam and Laos, attacking a small border post. Another aerial attack occurred the next day, August 2nd. In all of these cases, the personnel doing the shooting were South Vietnamese, but all the weapons and equipment were supplied by the US, and it was clear to the North Vietnamese that these were American-directed operations. Before we go farther, there are 2 issues we should talk about that don't fit very easily anywhere else but are important to understand. One is that the Gulf of Tonkin is a body of water where curious anomalies are known to occur, especially regarding radar. Clouds and other weather phenomena do show up on radar screens. It's how, for example, meteorologists track storms. But apparently, under certain weather conditions in the Gulf of Tonkin area, radar screens can reflect clouds and such as much smaller and much more distinct radar images, which can easily be mistaken on military radar for surface vessels. This can also happen with flocks of birds like seagulls, which obviously move much faster than clouds do. These radar anomalies have been nicknamed the Tonkin Spook. Simply put, because of local conditions, it's highly possible for military radar operators in this area to pick up false images of clouds and birds on their radar screens that look to them like man-made objects, especially small surface vessels. This issue is more relevant to the Phantom attack on August 4th than to the genuine one on August 2nd, but it's necessary groundwork for you to know. The second issue is that there was, in 1964, significant confusion over what constituted North Vietnam's territorial waters. Arguments over the Gulf of Tonkin incidents often involve claims that American ships were or were not in the territorial waters of North Vietnam. But the problem was that no one was sure what they really claimed and which claims were valid. In the 1960s, most nations fell into 2 major camps regarding territorial claims. Those who claimed waters 3 nautical miles off their shores and those who claimed 12 nautical miles. The United States claimed 3 nautical miles and generally behaved as if this was the only valid claim. Most communist countries were in the 12-mile claim camp. Although North Vietnam had not officially made a public claim about territorial waters, everyone assumed they claimed 12 nautical miles. Incidentally, this dispute is not still a live one today. International agreements and legislation in the 1990s made 12 nautical miles pretty much the standard, though there are still some occasional disputes. But that was not true in 1964. On its DeSoto mission in late July, the USS Maddox had orders not to approach closer than 8 nautical miles of the North Vietnamese coast, outside the zone the United States viewed as North Vietnamese territory and thus international waters, but most likely inside the boundary that North Vietnam considered its territory. You see where we're going with this. In the final week of July 1964, the top song on the American record charts was A Hard Day's Night by the Beatles, with Rag Doll by the Four Seasons at number 2, and Everybody Loves Somebody by Dean Martin at number 3. The movies in theaters included McHale's Navy, starring Ernest Borgnine, based on the hit TV show, The Unsinkable Molly Brown with Debbie Reynolds, and in some second-run theaters, an epic picture called The Fall of the Roman Empire, which I did a video on back in 2022. Popular shows on television included The Beverly Hillbillies, The Dick Van Dyke Show, and my favorite, Martian, with Ray Walston. Barry Bonds, baseball player, and Sandra Bullock, popular actress, were born in the last week of July 1964. The NASA probe Ranger 7 was approaching the moon, and on July 31st transmitted the first close-up photos of the lunar surface. This was what the world was like just before the Gulf of Tonkin incidents occurred. I'd like to quote, at considerable length, a document titled The Anti-U.S. Resistance War for National Salvation 1954 to 1975 Military Events, published in Hanoi in 1980, which is Communist Vietnam's official chronology of the war. I'll tell you in a moment why I'm quoting this particular document. What you're seeing on the screen are Google Maps images that were taken in and around the real Gulf of Tonkin, near where these events occurred 60 years ago. Quote, on 30 July, U.S. warships violated our coastal waters and fired on Han Nhu Island, Nay Tin Province, 4 kilometers from the coast, and Han Mei Island, Phan Hoa Province, 12 kilometers from the coast. On 31 July, the U.S. destroyer Maddox entered the zone south of Con Co Island to begin its tour of reconnoitering and threatening along our coast. On 31 July and 1 August 1964, U.S. airplanes based in Laos bombed the border defense post at Nam Can and Nong Dae village in Nay Tin Province, which were situated 7 to 20 kilometers from the Vietnamese-Laotian border. Faced with that situation, our naval forces adopted the policy of striking back and punishing pirates who violated our waters and our people's security. At noon on Sunday, 2 August 1964, our Navy's Squadron 3, consisting of 3 torpedo boats, was ordered to set out to resolutely punish the acts of piracy of the U.S. imperialists and to attack the destroyer Maddox, which had penetrated deeply into our coastal waters in the area between Han Me Island and Loc Trong in Phan Hoa Province. Our boats both launched torpedoes and fired on the bridge of the deck of the Maddox, which caused that ship to panic and turn around. It fired back with its guns and called in air support, but in the end it had to flee out of our country's coastal waters. End quote. Despite its obviously political language, this is, at least in its broad strokes, a fairly accurate view of what happened on August 2, 1964. North Vietnamese torpedo boats did go out to attack the Maddox. The North Vietnamese did expressly view this attack as retaliation for the various provocations the U.S. and South Vietnamese had been ramping up over the previous weeks and days. And in its general account of what happened, the North Vietnamese account matches American sources about what happened that day. Here's the first reason I chose to quote this source. If, as the conspiracy theory narrative holds, the entire Gulf of Tonkin affair was ginned up out of whole cloth to justify a predetermined escalation of the war by the American side, why on earth would the North Vietnamese admit that they had in fact attacked the USS Maddox? Not a single Vietnamese official in any record, as far as I know, has ever denied that the August 2nd attack on the Maddox did in fact take place. Here's the second reason. The exact same quotation appears in Robert McNamara's book, Argument Without End, In Search of Answers to the Vietnam Tragedy, published in 1999. This book was the outcome of a series of meetings occurring between 1995 and 98 between McNamara and various former high officials of the North Vietnamese military and government, a sort of reconciliation to set the historical record straight. That said, the North Vietnamese account leaves out some significant nuances. It makes it sound like the North Vietnamese Navy and government gave the order for the attack. Apparently, they didn't. What actually seems to have happened was that the North Vietnamese commander of Squadron 3, which is the 3 torpedo boats, decided on his own initiative to attack the Maddox. In fact, the North Vietnamese Navy Command issued a recall order when they found out the squadron had gone out, but the recall didn't reach the attacking vessels in time. Because the Maddox was monitoring North Vietnamese radio traffic, which was, after all, its mission, they intercepted the attack order given by the Squadron 3 commander. So they knew they were going to be attacked. However, the chances of a successful attack on a destroyer from these kinds of small vessels was pretty remote, and the Vietnamese knew that. It's apparently why that recall order was given. The realization that the attack, though symbolic, was strategically hopeless. The only damage the Maddox suffered was one bullet hole from one of the torpedo boat's guns. The Maddox, in addition to having intercepted the original attack order, also intercepted the recall order issued to the Squadron 3 commander by his superiors. Shortly after reports reached the U.S. military commanders that the Maddox had been attacked, American forces retaliated. 4 planes from the aircraft carrier USS Ticonderoga, on patrol nearby, went after the Vietnamese patrol boats that were then retreating. One of the aviators who flew this mission was James Stockdale, who a year later would be shot down over Vietnam and served 7 years as a prisoner of war in the infamous Hanoi Hilton prison. The jets from the Ticonderoga hit the 3 retreating patrol boats, and at the time the Americans believed they sank one of them, but that turned out not to be true. The damage they observed was less serious than they thought at the time. The North Vietnamese suffered 4 killed, 6 wounded. A few days after the attack, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara briefed several senators on what had happened, including Wayne Morse, one of the more critical politicians of Johnson's Vietnam policy. McNamara's testimony to the senators was highly inaccurate and misleading. He told them falsely that the U.S. Navy had no involvement in South Vietnamese missions on the coast, those Op Plan 34A raids that had provoked the North Vietnamese to attack in the first place. He claimed falsely that the Maddox was 30 miles from the coast when it first sighted the Vietnamese torpedo boats. In fact, it was closer to 15 miles. He painted the action of the Maddox in firing on the torpedo boats as purely defensive, warning shots and such. In fact, the Maddox was trying to sink the boats from the moment they saw them. In Washington, once informed of the attacks, President Lyndon Johnson decided not to order any retaliation beyond what had already been done, the airstrike from the Ticonderoga. In his memoirs, Johnson stated, quote, "We concluded that an overeager North Vietnamese boat commander might have been at fault, or that a shore station had miscalculated. So we decided against retaliation, but I ordered the Navy to continue the patrol, add another destroyer, and provide air cover. We were determined not to be provocative, nor were we going to run away. We would give Hanoi the benefit of the doubt this time and assume the unprovoked attack had been a mistake." End quote. The additional destroyer ordered into the area was the USS Turner Joy, which would figure heavily in the reported incident on August 4th. So, here's what we can conclude about the first attack. As a matter of historical fact, there is no doubt whatsoever that North Vietnamese patrol craft attacked the USS Maddox on August 2nd, 1964. The attack clearly was in response to the provocation by American and South Vietnamese forces, and U.S. policymakers, especially McNamara, distorted and gave misleading accounts of the incident. Of course, this was not the end of it. The second purported attack, which did not happen, is much more complicated and consequential. That's the subject of the next chapter. The Johnson White House was eager to communicate to the North Vietnamese that they would not be intimidated by the torpedo boat attack. That was why the second destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, was sent into the area to run backup for the Maddox. On August 3rd, another Op Plan 34A raid went off against the North Vietnamese coast, and a second raid was planned for the night of August 5th and 6th. Incidentally, what you're looking at on the screen is the actual USS Turner Joy, now a museum ship. There's been a lot of discussion about the issue of whether the Turner Joy and Maddox were sent back toward the North Vietnamese coast precisely as a provocation, in the hope that the Vietnamese would choose to attack again and thus give Johnson and the military the pretext they needed to escalate. In fact, George Ball, Undersecretary of State, who is famous as the only dissenting voice among LBJ's chief advisors in arguing against increasing direct military involvement in Vietnam, himself suggested that the destroyers were sent back specifically to arrange a provocation. There's no evidence to support this theory, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility. What's undoubtedly clear is that both sides, the US and the North Vietnamese, were very keyed up following the first attack, and both were eager to interpret the slightest action by the other as hostile. The night of August 4th, 1964, a Tuesday night, was, not to employ a cliche, a dark and stormy one in the Gulf of Tonkin. There was cloud cover so no moonlight was visible, and rain squalls were frequent. This is a significant fact because, as you recall, we talked about the Tonkin spook, the tendency for weather phenomenon in this area to generate false radar images of clouds or flocks of birds. This was a prime night for something like that to happen. Probably the most significant real thing that happened on August 4th was that the Maddox, which as you recall had that electronic snooping van on board, intercepted a number of North Vietnamese radio messages. One of them indicated that the Vietnamese had detected the destroyers in the area and in fact gave their positions. Another message ordered 3 torpedo boats to make ready for operations. The captain of the Maddox, a man called John Herrick, interpreted the messages as meaning that the North Vietnamese were planning a second attack. This is vitally important because it set the tone for everything that followed. The officers, the radar men, and the crew members aboard the Maddox and the Turner Joy, who were already spoiling for a fight, now expected hostilities imminently. A psychological condition called scenario fulfillment, generally unknown in 1964 but understood later, began to take over. Sure enough, as they cruised off the coast of Vietnam, this time well outside even the 12-mile limit that they presumed North Vietnam claimed as their territorial waters, radar men aboard the vessels started seeing radar contacts trailing them. We don't need to go into the exhaustive details. Suffice it to say, for about 2 hours, blips and dots appeared several times on the ship's radar screens, and at one point 3 of them appeared to converge some miles away from the destroyer's positions, as if coming together for a coordinated attack. The ships fired at the radar targets, some of which appeared to be planes in addition to surface ships. Over 300 rounds were fired, most by the Turner Joy. Herrick reported to the aircraft carrier Ticonderoga that his ship was under attack from ships and aircraft. The Ticonderoga launched 6 jets in pursuit. Again, as on August 2nd, one of the pilots involved was James Stockdale. Though he'd clearly observed the North Vietnamese torpedo boats 2 nights earlier, tonight, August 4th, he saw nothing. Radar operators on the Turner Joy, however, were convinced that there were bogies out there, and sonar contacts sounded like as many as 20 torpedoes were launched. One eyewitness even claimed to have seen a torpedo, but nothing was hit and there was no hard evidence of it. For about 2 hours, the destroyers chased and fired at these radar shadows. From the surviving documents, it appears that the men aboard them really did believe at the time that they were under attack. For example, the gunnery liaison officer of the Turner Joy, Ensign Douglas Smith, said later, quote, "When I tracked those things, there was no question in my mind that they were not phantoms," end quote. This isn't so far-fetched as it might seem. 24 years later, in 1988, the captain and crew aboard another U.S. Navy ship, the USS Vincennes, then on patrol in the Persian Gulf, saw a radar blip coming toward them and believed they were under attack by Iranian fighter jets. Tragically, when the captain ordered retaliation against the non-existent fighters, he shot down instead a civilian airliner, killing nearly 300 people. I did a video about the Vincennes that discussed this incident. This is the phenomenon of scenario fulfillment in action. It seems clear that something similar happened aboard the Maddox and the Turner Joy on August 4th, 1964. They really did believe they were under attack. But even shortly after the incident, the commanders started to rethink what they had just been through. A few hours after the alleged attack, Captain Herrick sent a message to Washington. It read, quote, "Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and over-eager sonar men may have accounted for many reports. No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken," end quote. Over the next 2 hours, Herrick sent 2 more cables to the Pentagon, reiterating that he wasn't sure an attack had really occurred, and urging them to follow up with air reconnaissance before they made any decisions on a response. McNamara probably saw these cables. Certainly, Daniel Ellsberg, a Defense Department official on duty that night, did. Ellsberg would become famous years later in 1971 for leaking the Pentagon Papers to the press. American forces intercepted numerous North Vietnamese radio messages that night and shortly afterward. Many of these messages were forwarded on to the Pentagon and ultimately reached the White House, and some mentioned attacks by North Vietnamese patrol boats on a U.S. destroyer. However, these messages were referring to the previous attack, the one that did happen on August 2nd, and the aftermath of it. On August 4th, the Vietnamese were still parsing what had happened. It seems pretty clear that this second alleged attack did not occur. No records or documents have come to light on the North Vietnamese side indicating that vessels were sent out there that night. In the 1990s, during those discussions between McNamara and his opposite numbers in the Vietnamese government, the Vietnamese vehemently denied that the August 4th attack took place. In his book, Argument Without End, McNamara says this, quote, "The August 2nd, 1964 attack by North Vietnamese patrol boats on U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin was ordered by a local commander who neither consulted nor informed leaders in Hanoi. The alleged second attack on August 4th never occurred. U.S. officials assumed the events in the Tonkin Gulf constituted an intended escalation by Hanoi. The U.S. retaliated with the first U.S. airstrikes on North Vietnam. Hanoi, knowing it had not ordered the attack, assumed the airstrikes were an unprovoked attempt to intimidate them." End quote. The airstrikes he's referring to were ordered by President Johnson and occurred on August 5th, the following day. The alleged second attack, occurring late at night Vietnam time, was happening at mid-morning in Washington the same day, August 4th. Throughout that day, as reports came in, Johnson and his advisors were already discussing potential retaliation and choosing targets, some North Vietnamese naval installations on the coast and an oil storage depot nearby. The operation was called Pierce Arrow. It consisted of 64 sorties by aircraft based on carriers in the area, including the Ticonderoga and the Constellation. However, the strikes were launched late. Part of the problem was that LBJ wanted to announce the retaliation on national TV, and as it was getting late, prime time was about to run out. He did finally make an announcement, which was, given the confused nature of the intelligence they'd received, full of inaccuracies. Notably, an hour before he went on the air, at about 11 p.m. Washington time, President Johnson called Senator Barry Goldwater to let him know what was going on. Goldwater, who, as you recall, was a hawk on Vietnam and anything dealing with communists, approved of the strikes. In fact, he issued a public statement which went out on the wire services. Quote, "I am sure that every American will subscribe to the actions outlined in the president's statement. I believe it is the only thing he can do under the circumstances. We cannot allow the American flag to be shot at anywhere on earth if we are to retain our respect and prestige." End quote. The strikes were successful in the sense that they did hit the targets chosen, but they didn't do much damage to the North Vietnamese war machine. And 2 U.S. planes, both from the USS Constellation, were shot down. One of the pilots, Lieutenant Richard Sather, was killed. Another, Everett Alvarez, was captured by the North Vietnamese and became one of the earliest U.S. prisoners of war, and the earliest from the U.S. Navy. Alvarez spent over 8 years in Vietnamese captivity, enduring torture and other hardships. He was released after the American withdrawal from Vietnam in 1973. He is still alive as of the making of this video at the end of 2024. A lot was happening on August 4th, 1964. Remember those 3 civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, who had disappeared in Philadelphia, Mississippi at the end of June? On August 4th, the same day as the alleged second attack on the Maddox and the Turner Joy, their bodies were found at a dam along Highway 21 outside of Philadelphia. They had been brutally murdered. The next day's newspapers carried banner headlines, both about the discovery of the bodies and about the Gulf of Tonkin incidents. In the immediate aftermath of the alleged August 4th attack, the decision makers in Washington, including Lyndon Johnson, clearly seemed to have believed that it was real. Johnson believed it when he ordered the Pierce Arrow retaliation on the evening of August 4th. However, like Captain Herrick, the bigwigs in Washington quickly began to develop doubts. A few days later, Johnson remarked to George Ball, Undersecretary of State, quote, "Hell, those dumb, stupid sailors were just shooting at flying fish." Yet the political machinery was already moving forward. The White House dusted off the draft congressional resolution for authorization of force, submitted it, and got it passed on August 7, 1964. Why, if the second attack did not happen, and Johnson, McNamara, and the others knew or should have known it didn't happen, why did they proceed with the resolution? This is the central question in the whole Gulf of Tonkin incident? I can answer, I think, in one word: politics. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was spurred primarily by domestic political concerns within the context of the 1964 presidential and congressional elections. Johnson did not want to leave himself open to political attack from the right, mainly Goldwater, for failing to act decisively against what the conservatives would obviously argue was communist aggression and provocation. He also did not want his Vietnam policy to become a political football in congressional races, because he would need a strong majority in Congress to pass his Great Society programs. Getting senators and representatives on record as supporting his policy in Vietnam would neutralize the issue from both the right, who wanted even stronger measures in Vietnam, and the left, a few of whom, a very few in 1964, opposed them. Johnson could claim, "I'm a moderate and I'm steering a moderate course." Edwin Moise, the historian who studied the Gulf of Tonkin incidents probably more closely than any other single historian, had this to say. It's a long quote, but I think highly illuminating. Quote, "Even if there had been doubts about the reality of the August 4th attack, the political pressure on Johnson to react as if the incident had been real would have been very strong. He was in the middle of an election campaign. His opponent, Senator Barry Goldwater, was a conservative who advocated a very hard line against communism. Johnson was campaigning as a moderate. 2 American naval vessels had reported to Washington that they had been attacked by communist forces. If Johnson had refused to take action on the grounds that he was not sure the report had been accurate, he could not reasonably have expected to keep the story from reaching the public. If it did so, then regardless of the final outcome, if the attack turned out really to have taken place, or if it turned out not to have taken place, or if the truth could not be established either way, at least some voters would have been convinced that the attack had been genuine, that there had never been serious grounds for doubting its reality, and that Johnson had attempted to cover up a communist attack on U.S. fighting men either out of cowardice or out of political expediency. He would surely have lost votes. With bad luck, he could have lost a great many votes." End quote. I agree completely with this analysis. This is the reason for the retaliatory airstrikes and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Furthermore, there's another important consideration. The August 2nd attacks undoubtedly did occur. There's no question about that. And there were no doubts expressed either from people who were out there on the water in Vietnam, like officers aboard the Maddox, or from analysts or decision makers in Washington. Whether that attack had been ordered by Hanoi, or had been ordered by mistake, or had been ordered purposely but then somebody changed their mind, it did occur. North Vietnamese torpedo boats did fire on American vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. Whether they were provoked by American actions, the Op Plan 34A raids, which clearly they were, no one knew that publicly. Johnson couldn't have revealed that publicly in any event. And given the political considerations, even if the August 4th attack did not happen, the August 2nd one did. And that, I think, Johnson and McNamara reasoned was good enough. They had decided on August 2nd not to retaliate for that specific attack, but now on August 4th, they essentially changed their minds. Keep in mind here that I'm not arguing that I agree that their ultimate decisions were correct, politically or morally, though I'm sure people in the comments will accuse me of taking that position. What I am arguing is that this was the line of reasoning that they ultimately adopted, and this was why they proceeded with the resolution. As you recall, the draft resolution already existed. It had been written by Bill Bundy, George Bundy's brother, a few months earlier. Johnson sent it to Congress on August 5th, the day after the late-night airstrikes. On that day, Johnson met with several key congressional leaders, particularly senators, to secure their support. There was at this time no sense of public doubt about the reality of the August 4th attack, and in any event, that the August 2nd attack had occurred was absolutely established. The next day, August 6th, the Senate Foreign Relations and Armed Services Committees both held brief hearings on the resolution. McNamara testified at them. Oregon Senator Wayne Morse, who would later emerge as a major critic of the Vietnam War, had gotten wind of the Op Plan 34A shenanigans and directly questioned McNamara as to whether North Vietnam's attacks had been provoked by these operations. McNamara replied, quote, "Our Navy played absolutely no part in and was not associated with, was not aware of any South Vietnamese actions, if there were any. I say this flatly. This is a fact." End quote. Of course, this was a lie. Op Plan 34A was primarily an American operation, not a South Vietnamese one, although the guys who actually hit the beaches or blew up bridges were usually South Vietnamese nationals. And the U.S. Navy did play a role in these operations, including the DeSoto patrols designed to gain intelligence in advance of them. But neither Morse nor anyone else had any hard evidence of that, and it would have been politically impossible to call out the Secretary of Defense as a liar in a live hearing with no evidence, given everything that had happened. The wording of the resolution was very broad. It said, quote, "Congress approves and supports the determination of the President as Commander-in-Chief to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. The United States is prepared as the President determines to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed force, to assist any member or protocol state of the Southeast Asia Collective Defense Treaty requiring assistance in defense of its freedom." End quote. On August 7, 1964, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution 416-0. The vote in the Senate was 88-2. One of the two dissenters was Wayne Morse, who feared, rightly, that the resolution was a blank check to the White House. That, and not doubts about the reality of the Gulf of Tonkin attacks, was the reason he voted no. The other dissenter was Ernest Gruning of Alaska. Johnson's retaliatory strikes and the resolution were extraordinarily popular among the public and had the desired effect of neutralizing Vietnam as a campaign issue. Shortly before the Gulf of Tonkin incidents, a Harris poll found that 58% of poll respondents disapproved of Johnson's handling of the situation in Vietnam, with 42% approving. After the incident, 72% approved and 28% disapproved. This is, in polling terms, an absolutely dramatic reversal. Constitutionally, one question remains. The Constitution gives Congress, not the President, the power to declare war. Why did Johnson not ask Congress for a declaration of war against North Vietnam? The answer lies in a fear that lurked behind everything American policymakers did during the Vietnam War. In the Korean conflict in 1950, for which President Truman also did not ask Congress to declare war, the North Koreans who attempted to invade and take over South Korea were nearly defeated when suddenly communist Chinese troops entered the war to prevent their ally from totally collapsing. China's potential involvement in Vietnam was a constant fear during the later war. Johnson, McNamara, and the others wanted to win in Vietnam with the absolute bare minimum of force and effort. Declaring war, they reasoned, would have alarmed China and the Soviet Union and caused them to step up their aid to North Vietnam dramatically. Furthermore, a declaration of war would have led to calling up the reserves of the U.S. military, thus bringing the conflict home to large numbers of ordinary people. The U.S. still had the draft in 1964. Above all, Johnson didn't want the war in Southeast Asia to distract attention, political will, or resources away from the Great Society programs he wanted to pass as soon as he was elected. Thus, the road to war in Vietnam was through a resolution, a statement of support by Congress, rather than the constitutionally mandated procedure of declaring war. This is the First Union Baptist Church in Meridian, Mississippi. Here, on August 7, 1964, the same day Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the funeral of James Chaney occurred. After the funeral, the Chaney family had to leave Meridian because of racist death threats. The Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War were already on a collision course even at this early stage. Early in this video, I referred to what I call the conspiracy narrative of the Gulf of Tonkin affair. By this, I mean the false narrative that the attacks on American destroyers were literally fabricated by the White House as a pretext to get the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed, and thus to escalate the Vietnam War in accordance with some sort of prearranged plan. We've already seen how this narrative is factually false, but in this chapter, I want to address it in more depth. The Gulf of Tonkin is an adjunct to a wider and much more pervasive conspiracy theory. The idea that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963 as a result of some shadowy plot, the participants of which conspiracy theorists generally can never agree on. The CIA, the Mafia, or the military are the most commonly named. Conspiracy theorists, for whom the assassination of Kennedy is their main issue, sometimes try to rope the Gulf of Tonkin affair into a conspiracy narrative, often as as a means to explain a supposed motive for the assassination. This is one of the assertions in Oliver Stone's utterly ridiculous 1991 film JFK. One of the key sections of that movie involves a government agent, played by Donald Sutherland, telling New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, played by Kevin Costner, about how the assassination was done, specifically as a means to get the Vietnam War, principally for the benefit of the military and defense contractors. The Sutherland character, who's totally made up, mentions the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, and the film is meant to make you think that Kennedy was assassinated because he had decided to withdraw U.S. forces from Vietnam. This is the chief narrative I'm going to deal with in this chapter. I should mention, before we go farther, that no professional historians who have dealt with this material, or the Vietnam War generally, believe or endorse the conspiracy narrative as I've laid it out here. It's not as if there's a debate among historians about this. There isn't. The disconnect is between historians who know and have studied this material and non-historians, some of whom reject real historical analysis in favor of conspiracy theories. In any event, the facts demonstrate clearly that the Gulf of Tonkin conspiracy narrative is simply not true. First, Kennedy did not decide to withdraw from Vietnam. And second, Johnson had not decided to escalate it at the time of the Gulf of Tonkin incidents, much less nearly a year earlier before Kennedy's assassination. In fact, Johnson dithered and delayed as long as possible and did not firmly make an escalation decision until 1965, months after the Gulf of Tonkin incidents. First things first, Kennedy was not assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. He was killed by one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone. All of the evidence indicates that beyond any reasonable doubt. Nearly everything that conspiracy theorists point to is either flat out false or a distortion of reality or some kind of innuendo that is completely unsupported by empirical evidence. Case in point, there was no quote-unquote magic bullet that hit Kennedy and Governor Connally. That there was is a flat-out fabrication by conspiracy theorists who deliberately misrepresent what happened. There was no bullet hole in the limousine's windshield. There was no evidence whatsoever that any shot came from the front. There is no evidence that Kennedy's autopsy was botched or that the Parkland Hospital doctors saw anything different than the autopsy found. Oswald was conclusively proven to have fired that rifle, the same one that he used months earlier to try to kill someone else. The list goes on and on. All of this is discussed in my two-part video series on Oswald and the assassination, which is linked here and in the description. I don't need to rehash it all. The conclusion that Oswald did it, and that he did it without anyone else's help or at anyone else's direction, is absolutely overwhelming, conclusive, and irrefutable. So it's abundantly clear that there was no conspiracy. Even aside from that, the idea that Kennedy was killed as a means somehow to achieve the Vietnam War is a silly one. The historical evidence demonstrates, again in my view conclusively, that it's simply not true. When you really look at it, Kennedy's policy on Vietnam was incoherent. He really tried to have it both ways. He was unwilling to take steps that would get the United States more deeply and directly embroiled in the Vietnam conflict, such as bombing North Vietnam or sending combat troops, as opposed to forces that could, with some squinting and obfuscation, theoretically be referred to as advisors. Kennedy constantly hoped and relied upon the South Vietnamese regime of Ngo Dinh Diem to step up to the plate and work harder to resist the Viet Cong and the threat of being taken over by the Communist North. In the second half of 1963, when he realized Diem was hopeless, Kennedy rolled the dice on supporting the coup against Diem, in the hopes that whoever came out on top would be a more capable ally than Diem had been. But on the other hand, Kennedy was also unwilling to abandon South Vietnam to the communists. He wanted to lower the numbers of American advisors in the country, but he was clearly not planning and not willing to withdraw them entirely until and unless there was some indication that the South Vietnamese regime was stable enough to resist the North on their own. So, while he wasn't willing to escalate, Kennedy was not willing to withdraw either. Nothing demonstrates this more starkly than an interview Kennedy gave to CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite at the beginning of September 1963. This interview is sometimes cited by conspiracy theorists as evidence that he was planning to withdraw from Vietnam. But, like the Robert McNamara interview in Fog of War, they usually omit a key section and cherry-pick statements out of context. Kennedy said to Cronkite, quote, "I don't think that unless a greater effort is made by the government, meaning Diem, to win popular support that the war can be won over there. In the final analysis, it is their war. They are the ones ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them, we can give them equipment, we can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists." End quote. This certainly sounds like Kennedy has decided that Vietnam isn't worth American involvement, right? Well, listen to what he says just minutes later in the same interview. Quote, "All we can do is help, and we are making it very clear. But I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That would be a grave mistake. I know people don't like Americans to be engaged in this kind of an effort. 47 Americans have been killed in combat with the enemy. But this is a very important struggle, even though it is very far away. We took all this, made this effort to defend Europe. Now Europe is quite secure. We also have to participate, we may not like it, in the defense of Asia." End quote. See, he wanted it both ways. This inherent contradiction, we have to let South Vietnam fight for themselves, but we can't withdraw either, that contradiction was not resolved by the time Kennedy was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald in late November. The usual counterpoint to this purported evidence that Kennedy did intend to withdraw is this document, National Security Action Memorandum 263, which Kennedy approved on October 11th, 1963. There are actually several documents in this bundle that are cited, and which this document references, but the one most often pointed to, a memo dated October 2nd, 1963, says, quote, "The military campaign has made great progress," and it also envisioned that U.S. advisors could turn over military functions to South Vietnam and hopefully leave by the end of 1965. However, if you read these documents, not just NSAM 263, but the October 2nd, 1963 memo, you'll see that its main focus overwhelmingly is what the U.S. should do in the short term to get the DM regime to behave, stop repressing Buddhists, and be more effective at resisting the communist guerrilla war. It is not a plan for withdrawal. All three references to U.S. forces being withdrawn by the end of 1965 are coupled with statements about what conditions must be in place before that can happen. Example, quote, "We recommend that a program be established to train Vietnamese so that essential functions now performed by U.S. military personnel can be carried out by Vietnamese by the end of 1965. It should be possible to withdraw the bulk of U.S. personnel by that time." End quote. And, quote, "The security of South Vietnam remains vital to United States security. For this reason, we adhere to the overriding objective of denying this country to communism and of suppressing the Viet Cong insurgency as promptly as possible. By suppressing the insurgency, we mean reducing it to proportions manageable by the national security forces of the GVN, unassisted by the presence of U.S. military forces. We believe the U.S. part of the task can be completed by the end of 1965, the terminal date which we are taking as the time objective of our counterinsurgency programs." End quote. The memo does not talk at all about what happens if those conditions are not in place. What if essential functions now performed by the U.S. military personnel are not carried out by Vietnamese by the end of 1965? What if the insurgency by the North Vietnamese is not manageable by South Vietnam's own forces, unassisted by U.S. military forces? The memo doesn't say, but it clearly implies that U.S. forces would not be withdrawn in those circumstances. NSAM 263 is not a plan for withdrawal. It's not an order. It's not even an order for the military to begin planning to withdraw or think about withdrawal. It's all about what to do about that troublesome DM, whether he'll be overthrown by a coup, and what the U.S. should do if he is. In fact, as we know, he was. The successors to him, the regimes of Duong Van Minh and Nguyen Khan, proved even less effective at stepping up to resist the North Vietnamese. Thus, within only a couple of months, subsequent events rendered NSAM 263 basically a piece of toilet paper. Furthermore, NSAM 263 is not a statement by Kennedy to his military and civilian advisors. Look which way the conversation's going. The memo is from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Maxwell Taylor, and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to President Kennedy. They're telling him what he should decide to do about DM. It's not him telling them what he wants them to do. Since Taylor and McNamara were among the chief architects of the escalation of the Vietnam War in 1965, even if you stretch the meaning of this memo past the breaking point and claim that it represents evidence of an intent to withdraw American forces imminently, obviously it's Taylor and McNamara saying it to Kennedy, not Kennedy saying to them, "I have decided to withdraw." And the conspiracy narrative depends on Kennedy wanting something that the military and intelligence leaders didn't want and were supposedly willing to kill him in order to prevent. That scenario makes absolutely no sense at all. Finally, to believe in the Gulf of Tonkin conspiracy narrative and the idea that the military and intelligence community whacked Kennedy to get the Vietnam War they wanted and which he was supposedly unwilling to give them, you have to believe that they were convinced that his successor, Lyndon Johnson, was guaranteed to give them what they wanted. Otherwise, why bother? You never assassinate a leader unless you're sure that his successor won't be even worse. Lyndon Johnson did not want to escalate the Vietnam War. He delayed and dithered on the decision to do so until well into 1965, after the election was over, because he didn't want to think about it, and he didn't want the issue of what to do about Southeast Asia to divert political will or resources away from his Great Society ambitions. Indeed, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was primarily a means to get the issue out of the campaign and the headlines, an attempt to make it go away, at least for a few more months, until he could get elected. Throughout 1964 and the first part of 1965, Johnson's advisors consistently planned for and counseled Johnson to adopt stronger and more direct military measures against North Vietnam, bombing principally. Johnson continually resisted. Yes, he retaliated with a bombing raid after the Gulf of Tonkin incidents, and there was another retaliatory raid called Operation Flaming Dart, launched in February 1965 as retaliation for a Viet Cong attack on a U.S. military barracks, Camp Holloway. But the true bombing campaign, the sustained air offensive that the military chiefs wanted, called Operation Rolling Thunder, didn't get going until March 1965. Johnson was continually afraid that more and more direct military pressure on North Vietnam would spark negative reactions and possibly direct involvement by the Soviet Union and China. And he was always fearful that Vietnam would get in the way of his Great Society programs, which were flooding the halls of Congress in early 1965. Escalation was the last thing he wanted. Yet the JFK conspiracy theorists are telling us that this was the man whom the conspirators, whoever they were, wanted in the White House so bad that they were willing to kill their own commander-in-chief to get him. A man who waited a year and a half after the assassination to give them, extremely reluctantly and after much delay and with a great deal of strings attached, the war they supposedly killed him to get. That scenario makes no sense at all and has absolutely no evidence to support it. Just in case you need more convincing that the Gulf of Tonkin conspiracy narrative is wrong, let's take a look at what was going on with the defense budget in this period. Defense spending rose consistently and steadily during the Kennedy administration. In fiscal year 1961, JFK's first year in office, he asked Congress for $47.5 billion in defense spending. That went up to $51.1 billion in 1962, $52.7 billion in 1963, and $55.4 billion for fiscal year 1964, the year that was half over when Kennedy was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. Then Johnson got in. He had to send a budget to Congress for fiscal year 1965 only 2 months after he took the oath of office. His ask was $54 billion, $1.4 billion below the amount Kennedy spent the previous year. Furthermore, when the money was actually spent, the Johnson White House spent less on defense than what he had asked Congress for. He was cutting the defense budget in 1964 and early 65, not raising it. Does the president who consistently asked Congress for more spending on defense, that being Kennedy, sound like the guy who's planning to withdraw from the country's #1 trouble spot? And does the president who immediately asked Congress for less spending on defense and ended up spending even less than he asked them for, that being Johnson, does that sound like the guy who was planning all along to escalate the Vietnam War? Of course not. Yet this is precisely what the Gulf of Tonkin conspiracy narrative asks you to believe. If, as the conspiracy narrative implies, there was a shadowy cabal of defense contractors secretly pulling the strings of the U.S. government, salivating over the prospect of a Vietnam War that would inure to their financial benefit, why would the defense budget be going down considerably in the early part of Johnson's term? Wouldn't the government, if it was really controlled by greedy defense contractors, be buying tons and tons of weapons in preparation for the war they wanted? The greedy defense contractor motive is explicitly referred to in Oliver Stone's JFK movie. He wants you to think the manufacturers of helicopters were behind the Kennedy assassination. It's just nuts. The reason for Johnson's heavy defense cuts, even in a time when the military chiefs were consistently goading him to escalate, is easy to understand. He wanted to spend that money on his Great Society programs. This was a source of annoyance to the military chiefs. Joseph Califano Cano, an assistant to Robert McNamara at the Department of Defense, said this about Johnson's state of mind at the end of 1964. Quote, "We were poised to increase military activities there and bomb North Vietnam. In the eyes of the Pentagon, LBJ was a querulous wallflower, disappointingly reluctant to join the war dance in Southeast Asia." End quote. Many people here on YouTube watch my video series on the Kennedy assassination, or more accurately, they don't watch it at all, but simply read the title, Oswald Acted Alone, and then declare confidently that I am insane, or delusional, or stupid, or a bad historian, or a CIA agent. I ask you, what is delusional about insisting on facts and evidence before reaching a conclusion about what happened in the past? What's insane about the historical analysis I've just given you? I've got the facts to support my conclusions. I brought the receipts. You've seen them throughout this video. Indeed, what I've done in this chapter is the very essence of my job as a historian, to look at the facts and construct a reasoned conclusion about what happened in the past, why it happened, and what it means. The conspiracy narrative of the Gulf of Tonkin affair is simply wrong, and it's a violent injury that has been done to our collective understanding of the past. In this video, I've tried to set the record straight, and I believe I've done that. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed on August 7, 1964. While it effectively gave Lyndon Johnson a free hand to wage war in Southeast Asia any way he saw fit, it was many months before he actually used that power, which he and the military leaders believed that he would have had anyway, even if Congress had not acted. This is proof positive that the resolution was a measure aimed principally at domestic political concerns: Goldwater, the campaign, and Congress. The fall campaign went pretty well for President Johnson. He and his campaign managers deftly reinforced the narrative they'd already spun about Barry Goldwater, that he was a dangerous and radical extremist with an itchy trigger finger who couldn't be trusted with nuclear weapons. 1 month after the resolution, on September 7th, 1964, NBC broadcast a 60-second commercial for the Johnson campaign during its Monday movie show. The film they were showing was David and Bathsheba from 1951. This was one of the most infamous political commercials of all time, and here it is.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
This absolutely insane commercial was so inflammatory that it was shown only that one time. Though, of course, because it was newsworthy, the network news shows aired it over and over again while talking about it, giving the Johnson campaign millions of dollars worth of free advertising. Goldwater's campaign slogan was, "In your heart, you know he's right." The Daisy ad reinforced a feeling captured by a snarky rejoinder to his slogan, which went, "In your guts, you know he's nuts." On November 3rd, 1964, Lyndon Johnson utterly fire-hosed Goldwater in the presidential election. He won 61.1% of the popular vote, higher even than Nixon's blowout re-election in 1972 or Reagan's in 1984, and 486 electoral votes to Goldwater's 52. Never before in modern political history had a political candidate been so brutally humiliated at the polls. Because they were so rarely mentioned in the campaign, Vietnam and Southeast Asia were probably not significant factors in Johnson's victory. Most victorious presidential candidates claim, whether it's true or not, that they have a mandate going into their terms. Lyndon Johnson truly did. The Democratic Party gained 36 seats in the House of Representatives, thus giving Johnson a 2/3 supermajority. Democrats also won a supermajority in the Senate with 68 seats to the Republicans' 32. Indeed, in 1964, the Republican Party seemed to be at its low ebb in the 20th century, with the possible exception of FDR's early days days in office. Notably, however, Johnson lost the Deep South. Aside from Arizona, Goldwater's home state, the only states Republicans won that year were all pro-segregationist states in the former Confederacy, including Mississippi and Alabama. This was the beginning of what we call the party switch, the shift in attitudes and political allegiances, specifically regarding race and civil rights, between the Democratic and Republican parties. Johnson's embrace of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had a lot to do with that, but Vietnam would also strongly contribute to the shattering of the liberal consensus in American politics in the 1960s, if there can be said to ever have been one. One of the great potential mistakes in evaluating the Gulf of Tonkin incident is looking at it solely from the American perspective. It was not just an escalation by the United States, or more accurately, the legal groundwork for what would eventually become the major escalation in 1965. On the other side of the ledger, it marked a point of escalation by the North Vietnamese, the Chinese, and the Soviets. North Vietnamese propaganda marked the battle with the USS Maddox as a great victory. Ho Chi Minh attended a ceremony honoring the North Vietnamese Navy for their role in the battle. Politically, though, North Vietnam was battening down. On August 13th, 1964, Le Duan, Ho's second-in-command and the politician who was most directly running North Vietnam at that time, traveled to Beijing to meet with Mao Zedong. Le convinced the Chinese that the Gulf of Tonkin affair demonstrated that the U.S. would do anything to defeat North Vietnam, up to and including committing their own combat forces directly. China stepped up its aid to North Vietnam, and so did the Soviet Union. In September, the North Vietnamese Politburo met and hammered out a new war plan. The idea was to build up the North Vietnamese army quickly and hopefully score a knockout blow before Johnson began committing American troops directly to the conflict. In other words, before a full-scale American invasion of North Vietnam. The Vietnamese quickly began making plans for a major military offensive in the spring of 1965. On February 7, 1965, the Viet Cong attacked a South Vietnamese army base and a U.S. Army installation called Camp Holloway. 7 U.S. troops were killed and 104 wounded. Johnson's advisors pressed strongly for retaliation, and he finally gave in. The initial response was a series of air raids called Operation Flaming Dart. The North Vietnamese responded with another attack, killing 23 people, and Johnson ratcheted up the pressure again. Operation Rolling Thunder, the main intensive bombing campaign of the Vietnam War, began on March 2nd, 1965. It proved impossible to separate a vastly escalated air campaign from use of ground troops, which the Johnson advisors had generally not talked much about until this point. But with Rolling Thunder going forward, the Pentagon felt that more troops were needed to defend the bases from which the air attacks were launched against possible North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attack. So, on March 8, 1965, U.S. Marines waded ashore at Da Nang, site of one of the big air bases. This was more of a photo op than the kind of hit-the-beaches type battle that happened in World War II, but it was an extremely significant move. Rolling Thunder was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to demonstrate to North Vietnam that the U.S. could and would use overwhelming force in Southeast Asia to prevent South Vietnam from falling to them. It did not have that effect. Johnson's planners were chagrined. In June, they told him that the bombing campaign had been ineffective and he needed to increase significantly the number of ground troops. General William Westmoreland, the American commander in Vietnam, had consistently been asking for more and more troops, developing increasingly elaborate plans on how to use them. Plans that were largely fantasy once the gritty reality of ground combat in Southeast Asia started to become known. The major escalation was in July 1965. Johnson held one last round of contentious meetings with his advisors, some at Camp David. Robert McNamara was probably the most forceful in urging Johnson to escalate. Undersecretary of State George Ball was by now the last of LBJ's advisors who was opposed to going in. His arguments about how the U.S. would accomplish nothing and the war would split the nation domestically proved prophetic. Ball shouldn't get the sole credit for being the one voice on Vietnam that turned out to be the right one. Throughout this early phase of the war, 1964 and 65, memos were piling up in file cabinets in the Pentagon and State Department, analyzing the policy and concluding, warning that the U.S. was unlikely to prevail in a protracted military conflict in Vietnam. The documents, thousands of them, also laid bare the real reasons the United States went into Vietnam. The documents were eventually made public in 1971 as the infamous Pentagon Papers. The leak of the Pentagon Papers was a major cause of the Watergate scandal, which I covered in depth in another video. One of the things the Pentagon Papers made clear was that it wasn't really about trying to save South Vietnam from communism. As I said at the beginning of the video, the US didn't give a whit about South Vietnam. It was all about prestige, about not looking weak, and about sending messages to the communists that America wouldn't back down. It was also about sending messages to South Vietnam itself. You better shape up and do your part to defeat North Vietnam, or else ... Whatever came after the ellipsis was never explicitly defined. South Vietnam and its corrupt leaders, starting with Diem, but certainly not ending there, did take a message from all this. The message they took was, why should we stick our necks out to defeat the communists? Johnson and the Americans will do it for us. Indeed, South Vietnamese military and political leaders quickly learned exactly how to manipulate the Americans. Let them think that South Vietnam was on the verge of collapse, or even worse, on the verge of opening up negotiations with the North, and suddenly tens of thousands more American troops and clouds of heavy airplanes would appear to quote-unquote strengthen the resolve of South Vietnam. This is one of the many places the Vietnam War eventually ended. This, of course, is the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, on whose black granite surfaces are etched the names of 58,000 Americans who died in the conflict between 1959 and 1975. It's a pilgrimage site for those who lost loved ones during the war. This is another place the Vietnam War ended. This is a museum and memorial on the site of one of the many massacres in the Cambodian genocide, which occurred between 1975 and 79. This ruthless purge by a communist regime called the Khmer Rouge was a direct outgrowth of the Vietnam conflict. It killed anywhere from 1.2 to 2.8 million people, in addition to the perhaps 2 or 3 million dead in the broader Vietnam War as a whole. Yes, those are human skulls in those glass cases. After more than 20 years of war involving many countries, not just Vietnam and the United States, Cambodia, Laos, China, South Korea, Australia, and others, basically the whole of Southeast Asia is littered with the bones of the people who pay the ultimate price for so many miscalculations and bad choices by so many people. The Vietnam War is a massive human tragedy on an immense scale. Here is what happened to some of the major players in our story. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam, was already slowing down by the time of the Gulf of Tonkin incidents and had passed off many of his duties to his deputy, Le Duan, who was the effective leader of North Vietnam in this period. Ho died of a heart attack in early September 1969. Le Duan was Ho's successor and led North Vietnam through the latter phases of the war, including the final victory in April 1975 when North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon and officially reunified the country, fulfilling the North Vietnamese Communist Party's goal set back in 1959. Le Duan remained the leader of Vietnam until his death in 1986. John Herrick, captain of the USS Maddox, served with distinction throughout the conflict and eventually wound up as the commander of the Naval Ammunition Depot in Portsmouth, Virginia. He died in 1997. His ship, the Maddox, a World War II-era ship, went on numerous active-duty cruises during the Vietnam era before being decommissioned in 1969. She was ultimately scrapped in 1985. The Turner Joy, a newer ship, went on to serve after the Vietnam War and was ultimately decommissioned in 1982. She is now a museum ship, permanently moored in Bremerton, Washington. James Stockdale, one of the naval aviators who flew missions against the North Vietnamese torpedo boats that attacked the Maddox, went on to fly numerous other combat missions. In September 1965, he was shot down over Vietnam and taken prisoner. He spent 7.5 excruciating years being tortured by the North Vietnamese until he was released at the end of the American phase of the war in early 1973. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his service. After the war, he commanded the Citadel, a military Military Academy in South Carolina and served briefly in the Reagan White House. In 1992, independent presidential candidate Ross Perot made Stockdale his vice presidential nominee. His performance at the vice presidential debate that year, where he appeared to be a confused old man, was somewhat unfairly lampooned on Saturday Night Live. He died in 2005. Lyndon Johnson's fate scarcely needs a description. Despite his crushing 1964 election victory, his single full term as president was troubled and tragic, not just because of Vietnam, but also unprecedented racial strife and political division. Having committed the United States deeply into Vietnam, he searched in vain for a way out, but he couldn't bring himself to withdraw. He'd originally planned to run for a second full term in 1968, but the candidacy of Eugene McCarthy, an explicitly anti-war candidate, and the ever-present political threat of Robert Kennedy persuaded Johnson to drop out of the race at the end of March 1968. He turned over power to his successor, Richard Nixon, who escalated the war yet again, especially with the invasion of Cambodia in 1970, before he brought a nearly 5-year negotiation process to an end, which resulted in American withdrawal. Lyndon Johnson died at his Texas ranch about that same time, January 1973. Toward the end, he was something of a broken man. As for his advisors, the best and the brightest, as termed by journalist and historian David Halberstam, their subsequent careers were checkered, but never really that tragic. LBJ eventually stopped listening to McGeorge Bundy, who quit government in 1966, went on to teach history at New York University, and died in 1996. His brother Bill Bundy, who as you recall mostly wrote the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, stayed on briefly into the Nixon administration, but eventually stepped down in 1969. He too went on to academia, teaching at MIT. He died in 2000. Dean Rusk served out his term as Johnson's Secretary of State, replaced in early 1969 by Nixon's nominee, William Rogers. Rusk had consistently been a hawk on Vietnam throughout Johnson's term and resisted bombing pauses or any real conciliation toward North Vietnam. After his stint as Secretary of State, he taught law at University of Georgia and died in 1994. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, a special mystique came to surround Robert McNamara, Johnson's Secretary of Defense. Though he was not the only formerly hawkish LBJ advisor to express regrets about the war, he was undoubtedly the most high profile. His turn began even before he was out of office, and undercutting the Johnson administration, especially when talking to congressional committees, caused him to fall out of favor with the president he had served for so long. At the end of February 1968, while the turmoil from the Tet Offensive was still rippling through the White House, McNamara was replaced as Secretary of Defense by LBJ's old friend Clark Clifford. McNamara went to head up the World Bank, a position he held till 1981. His extensive speaking and writing about the war, and his own mistakes in being one of its chief architects, earned him a great deal of attention. The lengthy interview that McNamara gave to filmmaker Errol Morris, which eventually became the basis of the documentary film Fog of War, was not the only or the most important critical self-reflection that McNamara engaged in during his later years. As I mentioned early in the video, however, McNamara's statements on the Gulf of Tonkin in that film are often cited, almost always taken out of context, in support of the conspiracy narrative. This is probably because most conspiracy theorists are too lazy to read books, so the movie is all they know about. In reality, McNamara's statements in that film are entirely in line with other things he said and wrote about the Tonkin affair, principally in his 1999 book, Argument Without End, a major source for this video. In case you need to hear it again, McNamara's evaluation, entirely consistent with the historical sources that we know of, including North Vietnamese sources, was that the August 2nd attack undoubtedly did occur, and the August 4th alleged attack did not. The incidents were misused and disingenuously misrepresented by officials in the Johnson White House, including Johnson himself, but it was not fabricated or staged. History, as it usually is a bit more complicated than the simplistic and reductive explanations that often take root in popular culture. If you like this video, please hit the like button, share it, do all the stuff that you normally do for a video you like. I now have a members section on my YouTube channel. If you join it, you can see an ad-free version of this video with additional material. On the members version, there's a whole separate chapter on the 1964 Democratic Convention and some other additional material. The sources I used to make this video are listed in credits at the end and also down below in the description. No part of this video, including the research or writing of the script, was done with AI. My new novel, The Gangster Crown, is available on Amazon Kindle and in paperback. The link to that that is in the description. I also teach history classes online at my website, seanmunger.com, and you can sign up for my blog at gardenofmemory.net and get columns delivered directly to your email. Thank you to all my fans and supporters. And thank you once again for joining me on another journey into the past.